Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 68 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Dallas Stars, in which the Sharks have lost 5-4. This was a return to the Shark Tank for Joe Pavelski. Pretty exciting times. Fans were obviously looking forward to this one, and the Sharks started off well enough by scoring the first goal of this game relatively early on. Nick Bonino, his 9th of the season, which I was actually kind of surprised to hear he even had 8 previous goals, but it was 1-0 San Jose early. However, after that, the wheels came off. The Sharks started making a couple of pretty egregious misplays, some really bad giveaways, some poor defensive zone coverage, things that we have seen from them a lot over these past few games and honestly a lot of this season. And the Stars were able to get 4 goals in that first period, with the last one coming in the dying seconds with literally 0.3 seconds left on the clock. And so the Stars held a 4-1 lead at the end of the first period. However, after that, the Sharks really settled things down, and in the second period they would only manage the single goal, but they certainly stopped the bleeding, and so the Sharks were now only down by 2 heading into the third period. Unfortunately, in the third period, that was mostly controlled by the San Jose Sharks. The Stars would actually make it 5-2 with a goal from Joe Pavelski before the Sharks would manage to actually get on the board again. Leonard would get a goal with a few minutes to go, which would give the confidence to the San Jose Sharks to pull the goaltender in this game, and they would do exactly that. Sasha Chamilevsky, a beautiful move near the side of the net. He gets this puck just barely past Scott Wedgwood, and Couture is able to finish it off for his goal there, and then it's 5-4. But similar to the game a few days ago against the Colorado Avalanche that the Sharks ended up losing 4-3, it felt as though when the Sharks actually got to within 1 goal, when they came right there near the finish line, they just couldn't really get things settled. It seemed as though suddenly all the players turned into headless chickens for the San Jose Sharks. Players were colliding with each other. They were missing simple passes. Brent Burns at a point couldn't keep the puck in, which really forced a reset for the Sharks. And then eventually the game ends with Jamie Benn holding the puck along the boards in the last dozen or so seconds of this third period. And so in a game that the Sharks actually didn't look too terribly in, at least in general over the full 60 minutes, they end up dropping the decision 5-4. On to the players to talk about. We have the first line, which was once again pretty solid for the San Jose Sharks. Obviously did not actually score a goal in this game, which is somewhat surprising considering how they have been as of late, but I've talked about extensively both Meier and Hertl in these past few games, but a player who I've kind of glossed over multiple times was Alexander Barabanov. I've frequently mentioned him to be a good gel player, and he fits in onto this trio very, very well, but I feel like that is also not necessarily giving him as much credit as he deserves. Barabanov has been a very integral part of this top line for the San Jose Sharks. He is an extremely skilled player. He definitely isn't in a situation where he's kind of just getting carried. It kind of reminds me of a comparison to early on in the season, which was when the Sharks were running a first line of Couture, Meier, and Dahlin. Dahlin was filling a similar role as what Barabanov is doing now, but while Dahlin, he was not really a play driver, he was more so someone who found himself in the right place at the right time, was able to read plays pretty well, and as such, he was actually having success on that first line. But once he was studied and understood by the teams around the league, Dahlin started struggling, and he hasn't really busted out of that struggle much for the rest of that season, and eventually that line was separated and the rest is essentially history. But with Barabanov, he's not just finding himself in the right place at the right time, he's not just, putting himself in a position so that Meier and Hertl can feed pucks to him and he can maybe benefit from that, and he's occasionally getting a secondary assist or things like that. Barabanov is doing a lot of work on this first line, and while Meier and Hertl are obviously the real driving forces, and if I were to put Barabanov in, let's say, a third line with Bonino and Gregor, I wouldn't even expecting nearly the same success if I was going to do that with someone like Meier and I put him with Bonino and Gregor. But still, when Barabanov, and he has been, when he is put into a position to succeed in a situation like this with the Sharks' 2 best players, he has been doing a very good job at that, so that is nice to see. Hopefully the Sharks, like I said back in my trade deadline video, hopefully they can re-sign him. When it comes to the second line, there was a return of Jonathan Dahlin to this game, joining both Logan Couture and Rudolph's Balcers on the second line. I had been talking about how Couture definitely needed to get some better line mates here, and Bob Booner did set himself up seemingly in a position to have that placed with Dahlin and Balcers. However, oddly enough, this line didn't necessarily work all that well. There was maybe one shift in the first period where I thought Dahlin looked pretty good, picked off a couple of passes and made some decent plays, but besides that, there wasn't much doing, and eventually we actually saw these players get separated. Dahlin was moved down to the fourth line with Reedy. I believe Balcers was as well. Chamilevsky was brought up, so was John Leonard, and so it ended up being a complete swap between the second and fourth line wingers, which is, I guess, an indication of Bob Booner is not particularly happy. I mean, prior to Dahlin's injury, that was the situation, but with Balcers in particular, he has really been bouncing around a bit and has found himself more often than not in that bottom six. And while I don't think Balcers at his peak is supposed to be a second line player, he should be at least a solid offensive guy for the bottom six, and he hasn't really been that much of that over these past few games. So Balcers, it just hasn't really been looking too great. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, Bonino was joined by Nieto and Gregor, a combination that we have seen before in the past, and of course they did combine for the first goal of this game, Nick Bonino's 9th of the season, like I said. But I do think, in particular, Noah Gregor was a player who really stood out quite well. There was maybe 3 or 4 different shifts that I was very impressed with him, although generally as a whole it wasn't some sort of amazing game for Noah Gregor. Bonino and Nieto also didn't necessarily do a ton here, but you do have to give them credit for the one goal. It's hard to necessarily expect more from your third line than just scoring a goal in a particular game, because it's not something that necessarily happens super often. So not a terrible game for these players, though not necessarily world beater either. When it comes to the fourth line, this is where I do want to talk about, of course, Chamilevsky, Reedy, and Leonard was the fourth line to start this game, though like I mentioned, Chamilevsky and Leonard would eventually get promoted up to the second line, and they were big parts of the Sharks' last 2 goals in this game that made it a very interesting end, made it 5-4 San Jose. Of course, Leonard scored the goal that made it 5-3, a nice sort of sticking with it type of play. He deflects a puck off of a pass into a Dallas Stars defender, but then on a second attempt manages to push it past Scott Wedgwood. So nice there, first goal of the season for John Leonard after a few games where he's been kind of trying to find his footing at the NHL level. And then when it comes to Chamilevsky, unlike Gregor, who had that one moment where he looked good with the goal but then otherwise wasn't necessarily super effective in the game, Chamilevsky, I would say, had multiple very good shifts in this game, and I was actually planning on talking about him even before he ended up setting up this fourth goal from Logan Couture, but with that, it just kind of even goes further than what I was planning to say. Chamilevsky, a beautiful move there, and he had actually showed off his mitts a couple of times in this game, and with this beautiful move, he ends up just barely getting it past Scott Wedgwood in the crease. Logan Couture is able to finish it off, and like I said, the Sharks did end up bringing it close, so I suspect Chamilevsky could potentially start finding himself bouncing around here in this potential second line spot, considering the Sharks don't really have any real consistent second line wingers to work with. We don't exactly know the future for Kevin Labanc. There was a possibility that he was going to return for this game, but now there are rumors that he might just get shut down for the entirety of this season, and it's not as though Balcers and Dahlin have necessarily been inspiring a ton of confidence, so it honestly wouldn't surprise me to see the Sharks go into the next game not only with Chamilevsky on that second line, but also potentially John Leonard as well. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we had also a familiar face returning to the lineup. That would be Mario Ferraro, but he wouldn't be joining Brent Burns on the first pairing. Instead, Brent Burns and Megna would be kept together, and Carlson would be allowed to move back to his right side as Ferraro would join him on that second pairing, and that ended up working out rather well. It was a night and day difference for Erik Karlsson. Besides a couple of stumbles, he definitely looked a lot more comfortable in this back into his right side spot compared to the left side spot. There were no terrible egregious giveaways that I can think of off the top of my head. Ferraro also had a couple of nice plays. There was this one particular shift where he was trying to keep the puck in the zone, and he did so a couple of times extremely well, which was nice to see. And I don't think Ferraro was completely terrible defensively either, which at times prior to his injury he kind of was, so that was definitely nice to see. The first pairing, I did kind of just gloss over them a bit, but I will say Brent Burns and Jacob Magna continue to work pretty well together. Not anything super impressive, but Brent Burns once again with another goal here, though it was obviously off of a pretty lucky bounce, but generally not a bad game for him. The third defensive pairing does leave a bit to be desired in the situation where, once again, Bob Booner creates a third defensive pairing that just does not have a puck-moving defenseman, and so they get hemmed in their zone a decent amount, and this is a situation that's going to happen if you decide to keep Milosh in the lineup over a player like Ryan Merkley. I understand the reasoning why this was the case because of the fact that Merkley did have a pretty bad game in the previous one, and so you're thinking, oh, let's move him out because Milosh has been playing well. But when Milosh was playing with Carlson, that was an okay-ish situation. However, when Milosh is playing with Vlasic, it's not really a very good sort of a marriage of two play styles. They play very, very similarly, and it just doesn't necessarily work out super well. So I hope and I expect, honestly, to see Merkley back in the lineup, potentially with Vlasic still. And then when it comes to the goaltending, this was the real issue of the game, because you'll notice I've talked about the Sharks defensemen not playing necessarily so terribly through this game. Yes, there were a couple of these bad plays, a couple bad giveaways that led to some decent chances for the Stars, but generally it was a game in which the Stars scored 4 goals, but they probably didn't deserve that, I would say. I mean, they didn't really have many high danger opportunities, but Capo Kakkonen, who had been so good in the previous game against Colorado, kind of let the Sharks down a bit in this one. You take a look at a couple of these goals. The first one from Nemesnikov, it was off of a Sharks giveaway, but while not an easy save to make, it certainly wasn't impossible for Capo Kakkonen to not let this puck squeak through him. The Hakanpää one was a pretty fortunate bounce for the Stars as the puck goes straight to Hakanpää, and Capo Kakkonen has not much time to react to it, but still not an impossible save either. And we take a look at the Jason Robertson goal. This is one that Capo Kakkonen actually reads incorrectly. The puck goes off the back wall. Capo Kakkonen is expecting it to go onto the left side, but it actually bounces back onto the right side, which allows Robertson to bank it in off of him. So poor read there as well. And so generally, Kakkonen, he ends up getting pulled from this game. Reimer steps in, looks significantly better than Kakkonen ever did in that first period, only lets in the one goal, which he basically had no chance on, from Joe Pavelski, and almost allows the Sharks to come back. But it was a confidence move for Booner to start Kakkonen a second game in a row, and it just didn't really work out. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will take on the Edmonton Oilers, a team who they have had not a lot of success against this season at all. They've played them twice, and they've lost both times. So we'll see if finally the Sharks can get a win against Evander Kane's new team. Class dismissed.